They say a man is never truly forgotten until his name is no longer spoken. But what happens when a whole town turns its back on the very man who once carried them through storms, hunger, and loss? This is not just the story of an old fisherman and his broken rod. It's the story of George Harmon, a Navy veteran, a husband, a neighbor, and a quiet guardian of Millwater Lake. A man mocked, pushed aside, and humiliated until the waters he loved and the people he once saved rose to remember him. Stay with me, because what begins as heartbreak will turn into one of the most powerful stories of justice, honor, and memory you'll ever hear. And if this story moves you, don't forget to follow, like, and share your thoughts. It helps keep these voices alive. The lake was still wrapped in mist when George Harmon stepped out of his old pickup truck. His hands, scarred and weathered from decades at sea and on land, carried a tackle box that had seen almost as many dawns as he had. The faded navy blue cap on his head bore the stitched letters USS Liberty, worn thin from sun and rain, yet still sitting proudly on his crown. For 40 years this ritual had defined his life, casting his line into Millwater Lake. Not for profit, not for sport, but for the hungry neighbors and the struggling families who depended on him. George was not a man of grand gestures or loud words. His service in the Navy had taught him to move with quiet efficiency, to respect routine, and to endure with patience. When he came home to Millwater decades earlier, he chose the steady life of a fisherman, his boat rocking on the same waters where his father and grandfather had cast nets before him. His catches filled the soup kitchen, supplied widows who could no longer fish, and fed children who otherwise would have gone to bed hungry. He asked nothing in return. His joy was found in the gentle splash of a fish breaking the water's surface and in the grateful smiles of those who received his gifts. But the Millwater of George's youth was gone. The timber yards had been replaced by glass-front cafes, the bait shop by boutique stores, and the quiet shoreline by hotels promising luxury and exclusivity. The old town had been sold piece by piece, and now, in a single stroke, the heart of it, the lake itself, belonged to strangers. Horizon Leisure Group, a private resort developer, had purchased the waters and surrounding land. With the deal came fences, permits, and security guards who knew nothing of the people who had lived and worked there for generations. That Tuesday morning, as the first streaks of sunlight burned through the mist, George set his chair on the dock as he had thousands of times before. His fingers moved with slow precision, threading the line, preparing the bait. It was then a voice broke the silence. "Sir, this is private property now. You need to leave immediately." George turned, squinting at the uniformed young man standing stiffly a few steps away. The Horizon Leisure logo gleamed on his chest. The guard was barely older than George's grandson, his face smooth, his stance brimming with the kind of authority that comes not from experience but from orders handed down. "I've been fishing here since before your parents were born, son," George said, his voice calm, steady, and edged with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced storms far greater than this boy. The guard did not flinch. "That doesn't matter anymore. The lake is under new management. No fishing without a proper permit." George reached into his jacket pocket and drew out a small, worn card. Its edges were curled, its ink fading. It was a lifetime exemption signed by the former mayor years ago in recognition of George's service to the community. He had kept it safe for decades, the one paper that guaranteed him the right to keep casting his line. "I have permission," he said simply, holding it out. The guard barely glanced at the card. Then with deliberate slowness, he tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper was sharper than the autumn air. "This is worthless now, old man. New owners, new rules." George stood silent. The mist thickened around them, as though the lake itself were holding its breath. Somewhere behind him, a phone camera clicked on. Joggers had stopped to watch. Their whispers carried across the dock. Some snickered, others murmured in amusement. Not one spoke in his defense. George bent to pick up his fishing rod, the one his late wife Margaret had given him on their last anniversary before cancer took her away. His hand had just closed around it when the guard shoved him back. The rod fell against the dock, splintering with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. The crowd gasped, not in sympathy but in satisfaction at the spectacle captured on their screens. Consider that your warning, the guard barked, his voice sharp and loud, a performance for his small audience. Next time there will be trespassing charges. George knelt, gathering the broken pieces of the rod. His movements were slow, careful, reverent, as if folding a flag at a military funeral. He tucked the fragments beneath his arm, the weight heavier than steel. The crowd stared, but no one stepped forward. A man in expensive running gear muttered to his companion, "About time they cleaned this place up. That old guy's been squatting here for years." George heard the words. He did not respond. He simply turned, the mist parting before him, his silhouette retreating toward the truck parked at the edge of the dock. His navy cap slipped from his head, landing on the wood behind him, but no one picked it up. No one called his name. As he drove away, the sun rose fully, spilling gold over the water. In his rearview mirror, George saw construction trucks rolling in, their engines rumbling with the sound of a future that left no room for men like him. Yet before he turned his eyes away from the lake, George's fingers, almost without thought, folded the torn permit into precise military lines. His gaze swept the horizon one last time, the watchful eyes of a sailor who had once guarded lives at sea. The world saw only an old man humiliated. What they missed was a veteran silently preparing for another kind of storm. And on that morning, Millwater Lake, for the first time in decades, began to remember the man who had always belonged to it. The cabin stood quietly at the edge of the forest, a simple structure of pine logs weathered gray by years of storms and summers. George Harmon had built it with his own hands after leaving the Navy, not for grandeur, but for shelter, for family, for a life tied to the soil and water of Millwater. That evening, as he pushed open the creaking door, the silence of the place pressed heavier than usual. He carried the broken fishing rod inside and laid it carefully on the table, as though it were something sacred. In the corner, a cedar chest waited, filled with his most precious keepsakes. He opened it with slow, deliberate movements. Inside rested the folded American flag from Margaret's funeral, a shadow box of medals he never spoke about, and an old photograph of his unit standing proudly on the deck of the USS Liberty. He placed the shattered rod beside him. For a moment, he let his hand linger on the folded flag, the fabric smooth beneath his fingers, a reminder of the woman who had given him both love and strength. Later, he sat in his worn armchair, pen in hand, leather-bound journal resting on his knee. He had kept this journal since his Navy days, recording storms, calm waters, and everything in between. Now his words were heavier. Day 14 since being banned from the lake. I've never felt more like a stranger in the place I've called home my entire life. The lake shimmered in the distance, visible through his window, yet as unreachable as if it were on another continent. The shoreline where his father had taught him to cast a line was now guarded by strangers with radios and rules. The dock where he had taught neighborhood children to fish stood behind private property signs. His home had not moved, but the ground beneath him had shifted. That night, his phone buzzed. It was his daughter calling from Arizona. "It's time, Dad," she said softly, her voice both tender and insistent. "This town isn't yours anymore. Come live near me, near the kids. You'll have company, safety, peace." George listened, the silence between her words louder than the plea itself. He knew she meant well, but how could he explain that his roots were buried in the soil of Millwater, that his heartbeat had long since matched the rhythm of the lake's tides? He could not transplant himself without withering. "I'll think about it," he replied, though both of them knew he would not leave. The following morning, he discovered that the video of his humiliation at the dock had spread online. It had been clipped, edited, and plastered across social media platforms, stripped of context and turned into a cruel joke. Some called it "Boomer Can't Read No Trespassing Signs." Others titled it "Old Fish Fights New Lake Owners and Loses." Laughter rolled through the comments, sharp as barbed wire. "That generation thinks they own everything. Time to move to a retirement home, Grandpa. The world belongs to those who can pay for it." George scrolled for a while, then closed the phone. The weight of strangers' mockery didn't hurt as much as the silence of the people who knew him. Neighbors he had once helped had said nothing, done nothing. A whole town had turned its back. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. Bill Jenkins, the owner of the hardware store, stepped in with a familiar nod. He had known George for decades, one of the few left who remembered Millwater before the tourists and glossy storefronts. George poured him coffee the way he always had. "Heard what happened at the lake," Bill said quietly, shifting in his chair. "It's their property now," George answered, his voice calm, stripped of bitterness. "They can do what they want with it." Bill looked uneasy. "Town's changing, George. Maybe it's time to consider moving on." "Moving on," George repeated, almost to himself. He stared at the steam rising from his cup. "This is my home, Bill. I buried Margaret here. My whole life is in this soil." "I understand," Bill said, though his eyes betrayed doubt. "But the developers, they've got the council in their pocket. Word is, they're planning to make the whole lakefront a members-only resort. Annual fees higher than most locals can afford." "And what does the town think of that?" George asked. Bill hesitated before answering. "Most of the old families already sold and left. The newcomers, they like it. They call it progress." When Bill left, the cabin was quiet again. George stepped out onto his porch. The night was falling, the forest hushed, but across the water, the new security lights glared harshly against the dark. They stabbed at the sky, unnatural, a sign of ownership that was not earned but bought. He stood there a long time, remembering summer mornings when he had taught children to tie their first knots, when the lake had been open and free. He thought of the soup kitchens, the church meals, the quiet deliveries of fish to widows who couldn't catch their own. All of it, 40 years of service, erased with a signature on a developer's contract. The phone rang again. His daughter's voice was tight with worry. "They sent me the video, Dad. This is exactly why I've been asking you to come live near us." "It's just a misunderstanding," George said, unwilling to burden her with the full weight of his grief. "It's not, and you know it," she answered firmly. "That town doesn't deserve you anymore. They've forgotten who built it, who kept it going when no one else would." Her words lingered long after the call ended. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps Millwater no longer remembered. Yet as George looked toward the lake, he felt the pull of memory too strong to abandon. His father's hands had once guided his, casting a line into those waters. His grandfather had built the town's first fish market with catches from the same lake. Margaret had laughed beside him on its shore. How do you leave behind a place that holds the weight of your entire life? In the silence of his cabin, George knew the answer. Some men, like ancient trees, cannot survive if uprooted. He would endure, no matter how unwelcome he had become. Outside, the forest was still, the lake glimmering faintly in the distance. It was no longer his, but in his heart, it always would be. And though the world mocked him, though the town had turned its back, George Harmon remained. Stranger in his own home, yet unwilling to let go of the soil and the waters that had shaped him. The morning broke with a clarity rare even for autumn. The mist that usually clung to Millwater Lake lifted quickly, revealing a surface as smooth as polished glass. George Harmon sat on his porch with a mug of black coffee, the steam curling into the crisp air. The ritual of fishing was gone from his mornings now, and the emptiness of it pressed against him. He watched the horizon as though searching for something, though he didn't know what. At precisely 7 o'clock, a new sound reached his ears, low, steady, unmistakable. Not the lazy putter of recreational boats or the roar of jet skis. This was different, deeper, stronger. A sound he hadn't heard since his Navy days, the mechanical rhythm of marine engines, moving in unison. George rose slowly, setting down his coffee, his body stiff with age, but his instincts suddenly sharp. He walked toward the shoreline, his boots crunching on the frosted grass, and then he saw them. Out of the far mist, 8 naval rigid-hull inflatable boats emerged, cutting through the water with military precision. Each one flew an American flag at its stern, the fabric snapping proudly in the wind. The vessels moved in formation, not wavering even an inch, their engines humming with authority. On board, sailors sat in dress blues, not fatigues, not casual gear, but full formal uniform, as though attending a ceremony. The sight stopped George where he stood. His heart thudded in his chest, not from fear, but from something older, deeper. Recognition. Word spread quickly through Millwater. Doors opened, shopkeepers left their counters, and construction crews paused their machines. Within minutes, a crowd gathered along the shore, murmurs rising like waves. The security guard who had humiliated George only days earlier stood near the dock, radio in hand, his expression uncertain. The lead boat glided to the dock with flawless precision. A tall figure stepped all out, silver-haired, his posture straight as a mast. On his chest gleamed the insignia of a retired Navy colonel. He scanned the crowd before his eyes found George standing at a distance. "Attention!" the man barked. In an instant, every sailor on the boat snapped into perfect posture. The crowd fell silent. The colonel stepped forward. His voice carried across the water, strong and commanding. "My name is Colonel Samuel Everett, United States Navy, retired. 42 years ago, during the storm that nearly claimed the USS Liberty, Chief Petty Officer George Harmon saved 12 men from my unit. He carried the injured through raging waters, securing lifelines when the rest of us thought all was lost." A ripple of surprise moved through the townspeople. They turned to George, seeing not the old fisherman in faded clothes, but someone they had never truly known. Colonel Everett continued, his words sharp as steel. "What many of you don't know is that his service did not end when he left the Navy. During the flood of '89, he used his boat to evacuate 27 residents from the eastern shore. During the drought of '95, he installed water purification systems for families whose wells had failed. And for 4 decades, he has conducted daily water quality monitoring, records that the Environmental Protection Agency itself has relied upon." The murmurs grew louder, shame flickering in the faces of those who had mocked him, who had filmed his humiliation. Another figure stepped forward from the second boat, younger, his uniform crisp. He introduced himself with steady pride. "My name is Lieutenant Commander James Wilson. I exist because George Harmon carried my father through gunfire during the evacuation of Saigon. My father told me that day shaped his life. And when I could not afford college, it was George Harmon, anonymously, who paid my tuition through a scholarship fund for veterans' children in this county. I am here because a man who asked for nothing gave everything." The crowd shifted uneasily. The story they thought they knew, the old man clinging to a dock he no longer owned, was unraveling before their eyes. At that moment, a woman stepped from the third boat. Unlike the others, she wore not a uniform, but a dark suit. She held a folder in her hand. "I am Amanda Richards from the Department of the Interior," she announced. "This lake falls under the National Historical Waterways Protection Act due to its documented use by 3 Native American tribes. The sale of this property was approved without the federally required assessment. As of 0600 this morning, all development is suspended pending full review." Gasps rose from the crowd. The Horizon Leisure Group manager hurried forward, clipboard shaking in his hand. "This is a private event space," he began. "Actually, it is not," Richards cut in firmly. Meanwhile, a sailor handed a document to the security guard. The young man glanced at it, his face paling. "This is George Harmon's original agreement with the town of Millwater, dated 1983, the sailor explained. "It grants him lifetime fishing rights in recognition of his environmental service. As this is a federally recognized contract, it supersedes all ownership changes." Phones recorded everything, but the tone was no longer mockery. It was reverence. The hashtag George Harmon Day began trending even before the speeches ended. The veterans moved with quiet efficiency, erecting a plaque on the shoreline. It bore simple words: "In honor of Chief Petty Officer George Harmon, USS Liberty, in his decades of service to Millwater." Colonel Everett approached George, who had remained silent throughout, his Navy cap pulled low. The colonel extended his hand. "The men and women here represent 4 generations of sailors who know what honor looks like," he said firmly. "We heard what happened. Word travels fast among veterans." George's hands shook as he gripped his old commander's. His voice was rough, breaking through years of silence. "You didn't have to come all this way, Sam." "Yes, we did," Everett replied simply. "No one erases what you've done. Not for us and not for this town." Behind them, the mayor arrived, his tie crooked, his face pale. He took the podium hastily. "On behalf of Millwater," he began nervously, "I announce an immediate review of the lake sale. Furthermore, we establish a permanent veterans landing zone with guaranteed public access, and we reaffirm George Harmon's lifetime fishing rights." He held out a laminated permit shining under the sun. George accepted it quietly, saying nothing. What no speech captured, what no camera could record, was the shift in the eyes of the townspeople. They no longer saw an old man clinging to the past. They saw a man whose dignity had outlasted them all. And then, as silence settled, George did what he had always done. He walked to his truck, pulled out a spare fishing rod, older but intact, and returned to the dock. With steady hands, he cast his line into the lake. One by one, the veterans joined him, sitting beside him in perfect silence. No speeches, no declarations, just the sound of water lapping against the dock. For the first time in weeks, George felt the world align again. The lake had remembered him, and now so had everyone else. The days that followed, what locals now called Navy Day, were unlike anything Millwater had seen in decades. For the first time in years, the town paused to reflect. And for the first time in George Harmon's lifetime, people looked at him not with indifference or pity, but with reverence. The man who had been humiliated on the dock, mocked on video, and dismissed as a relic of the past, now stood as a living symbol of endurance, memory, and dignity. The mayor, bowing to pressure from the veterans, the townspeople, and the Department of the Interior, made a formal announcement. A permanent veterans landing would be established on the eastern shore. The area would remain open to the public forever, with George Harmon granted lifetime recognition of his fishing rights. The council voted unanimously, their earlier eagerness for development suddenly muted by public shame and political fear. The following morning, George did what came naturally. He walked down to the dock, rod in hand, the air carrying the sharp scent of autumn leaves. He cast his line into the water with the ease of a man who had done so thousands of times. His line rippled across the lake's surface, and then he simply sat, patient as always. But this time he was not alone. One by one, the veterans who had come to Millwater remained beside him. They sat shoulder to shoulder along the dock, their uniforms pressed, their faces solemn. None of them spoke, and yet their silence carried more weight than speeches ever could. Together they fished, not for sport, not for survival, but for something deeper, a restoration of honor. Word of the moment spread beyond the town. News crews arrived, their cameras capturing the stillness, the quiet defiance of a man casting a line into waters he refused to abandon. The footage circulated widely, framing the story as a modern David and Goliath struggle, one old fisherman against the machinery of wealth and development, and the quiet triumph of dignity over greed. Within a week, Horizon Leisure Group released a statement. Faced with public outrage, federal review, and a growing boycott movement, they announced a reconsideration of their development plans. Their glossy brochures promising luxury marinas and private clubs were now liabilities, and executives far away in their offices realized that the fight was no longer about land. It was about public perception. But George had little interest in corporate statements or news headlines. His joy came in smaller, quieter ways. One morning, a crowd of children appeared at the dock, clutching fishing poles borrowed from parents and neighbors. At first, they came out of curiosity. They wanted to see the man from the viral video, the fisherman who had faced down developers and stood his ground. But soon their interest deepened. They wanted to learn. George taught them the way he had once taught sailors, with patience, with respect, and with quiet authority. He showed them how to tie knots that would hold against a fighting fish, how to read the water's surface for subtle ripples, how to wait, not rushing, not forcing, but listening to the rhythm of the lake. One little girl, her braids swinging as she struggled with her line, looked up at him. "Do you ever get scared of the water?" she asked, her voice small but earnest. George paused, the question striking deeper than she could have known. He helped her secure the bait on her hook before answering. "I was terrified once," he said softly, "when the storm came down on my ship and the waves rose higher than the sky itself. But sitting here beside it, watching over it, no, I've never been afraid." "Because you're friends?" she asked, her eyes wide with the blunt innocence of childhood. George smiled faintly, gazing out at the calm expanse. "Because we understand each other. Water remembers everything it touches. It was here before us, and it will be here long after." The trick is learning to listen to what it's trying to tell you. The little girl nodded solemnly, as though he had confirmed something she already suspected. Not everyone's reaction was so direct. One morning, George arrived at his usual bench to find something waiting for him. A brand new USS Liberty cap, the navy blue fabric stiff and bright, the gold embroidery shining in the sunlight. No note accompanied it, no explanation. Only the gesture. George didn't put it on. Instead, he laid his hand gently on the brim, acknowledging the unspoken apology. Then he placed it on the bench and settled his old, faded cap back on his head. Some lessons he knew carried more meaning when left unsaid. Meanwhile, the town sought ways to repair what had been broken. A local woodworker crafted a simple, dignified sign. George's Landing, Keeper of the Waters. The dedication ceremony was small, but for those who gathered, the moment carried weight. George stood quietly at the edge, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding that the sign was more than about him. It was a declaration of what the community had chosen to value. The security guard who had once torn his permit never returned to the dock. Rumors spread that he had resigned, unable to face the weight of what he had done. George never spoke of him again. In time, the veterans who had traveled from across the country went home, returning to their own lives. Yet many returned, month after month, to sit beside George in the early hours. Colonel Everett came often, his tall frame casting long shadows across the dock as the sun rose. Their conversations were sparse, but when they spoke, it was with the ease of men who had endured together. "They're still planning to build on the western shore," the colonel remarked one morning, watching cranes rise in the distance. "Luxury condos, marina, the works." George adjusted his line, his face calm. "Change comes whether we welcome it or not. The important thing is making sure some things remain." "Like you," Everett said quietly, "still holding your post after all these years." George shook his head gently. "Like the water, I'm just passing through, same as everyone. But what we do while we're here, that matters." The dock grew into more than just a fishing spot. It became a place of gathering, of teaching, of remembrance. It became the point where past and present met, where an old fisherman reminded a changing town of the values that couldn't be sold. And through it all, George remained as he always had been, steady, patient, and quiet. Not demanding, not fighting, simply casting his line, reminding those who came after him that belonging isn't measured in ownership or profit. It's measured in care, in memory, in the simple act of remaining when everything else changes. George Harmon had become more than a fisherman. He had become the keeper of the waters. Spring arrived slowly in Millwater, the ice loosening its grip on the lake, the first green shoots pushing through thawing earth. For George Harmon, the passing seasons had always been measured not by calendars, but by the rhythms of the water. When the fish returned, when the fog lifted earlier, when the lake sang with frogs at night. He had lived long enough to know that change comes in cycles. But now change was coming in ways that felt permanent. The Veterans Council was established soon after Navy Day, a body meant to ensure that future development projects respected not only federal laws but the community's history. The mayor, sensing political opportunity, gave it his full support. George was invited to join, and though reluctant, he accepted. He sat through meetings in the old town hall, his presence quiet but unshakable. When discussions veered toward profit margins and tourism numbers, he would clear his throat and remind them, some things don't belong on a ledger. Some things belong to everyone. The council's first resolution was simple but profound. A portion of tourism revenue would be set aside to guarantee public access to Millwater's natural resources. For George, this was not a victory to boast about. It was a safeguard for children he hadn't yet met, for voices not yet born, who deserved the right to sit by the lake as he once had. Colonel Everett visited often, sometimes bringing fellow veterans, sometimes arriving alone. The two men would sit on the dock in the pre-dawn hours, their conversation minimal, their silence comfortable. "They're still building on the western shore," Everett observed one morning, pointing at cranes rising against the skyline. "Luxury condos, a marina big enough for yachts. Seems progress doesn't wait for anyone." George's eyes stayed on the water, his hands steady on the line. "Change comes, Sam. We can't stop it, but we can make sure something remains." Like you, Everett replied, his voice warm with respect. George shook his head slightly. Not me, like the water. I'm only passing through. But while we're here, what we choose to do, that matters. From the dock, they could see the new development shimmering across the lake. Its glass towers caught the sunlight, reflecting the very waters they sought to control. But George felt no bitterness. He understood why people came here, why they built. The lake promised peace, beauty, belonging. He hoped in time they would learn, as he had, that true belonging came not from owning the land, but from caring for it. His morning soon included more company than ever before. School children, notebooks in hand, came as part of a year-long science project. Their teacher explained that they were studying the ecosystem of Millwater Lake and hoped George could share his knowledge. He led them through lessons in patience and observation, showing them how to test water clarity with simple tools, how to identify species by their movements beneath the surface, how to recognize signs of stress in the environment. His old journals, filled with decades of handwritten notes, became treasure troves of information. Scientists from universities even began consulting his records, recognizing that George's daily observations stretched longer than many federal data sets. Mr. Harmon has been keeping daily records longer than the EPA, the teacher told her students. His notebooks are helping researchers understand climate change in our region. One boy raised his hand. But you're not a scientist, he said bluntly. George smiled gently. No, I'm just someone who's been paying attention for a very long time. And perhaps that was the heart of his legacy, not the medals tucked away in a cedar chest, not the plaque by the dock, but the habit of paying attention. In a world rushing forward, George represented something slower, steadier, irreplaceable, the value of bearing witness. As the months passed, the dock named George's Landing, Keeper of the Waters, became a gathering place. Families came to fish, veterans to reflect, children to learn. Tourists stopped by, not for luxury, but for a glimpse of the old man who had quietly become a national story. The security guard who had once humiliated George never returned, but one morning George found a gesture waiting for him. On his bench sat a new USS Liberty cap, its fabric stiff, its embroidery shining. No name accompanied it, no apology spoken. George placed his hand gently on it, then set it aside. His faded cap remained firmly on his head. Some apologies, he knew, carried more power when left unsaid. Life, in its quiet way, resumed. The western shore filled with cranes and scaffolding, glass windows rising against the horizon. Yet on the eastern side, the water remained unchanged, its ripples soft, its fish plentiful. George's line continued to stretch across it each morning, a bridge between past and present. He no longer fished only for himself or the soup kitchens. He fished for the children who sat cross-legged beside him, for the veterans who returned month after month, for the townspeople who now greeted him with nods of respect instead of indifference. His presence reminded them of something they had almost forgotten. That value is not measured in profit, but in memory, not in ownership, but in belonging. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold and crimson over the lake, George sat alone on the dock. The water mirrored the sky, endless and calm. He thought of Margaret, of the sailors he had carried through storms, of the children who now learned at his side. He thought of his daughter's voice urging him to leave, and he smiled softly, knowing she would understand someday why he stayed. Some people live their entire lives just to sit quietly in the same place, to hold on to what others discard, to keep watch when no one else remains. George Harmon was one of those people. And in the still waters of Millwater Lake, his legacy endured, not in stone or ceremony, but in the patience of fishing lines, the laughter of children learning to listen, and the memory of a man who refused to let go. Because some battles are not fought with weapons. They are fought with dignity, persistence, and the simple act of remaining when everything else changes. And George Harmon, fisherman, veteran, husband, father, and keeper of the waters, had won his battle.